From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Issue 1, a complex relationship.
He's giving me some tips. He's going to help me fit out my bracket, so...
and he's going to teach me cricket.
Yeah, that's the deal.
4 years ago, President Obama and British Prime Minister David Cameron bonded over basketball. The special relationship seemed both personal and strong. But in 2016, the special relationship is a little more complicated. Enter Jeffrey Goldberg. Writing at The Atlantic magazine, Mr. Goldberg quoted President Obama as lamenting Mr. Cameron's attention towards Libya. Mr. Cameron, Mr. Obama said, had become, quote, distracted by a range of other things, unquote. Britons reacted angrily to the rebuke. Still, the McLaughlin Group spotted the tensions before most. During our December 12, 2014 episode, we noted growing disagreements between the U.S. and the U.K. over defense spending. While those tensions are now resolved, UK-U.S. relations are increasingly complicated. Question, what's wrong here, Pat?
Well, I think, Johnny, first off, the President of the United States, even if that's the way he felt, should not be saying that to Mr. Goldberg of The Atlantic, giving his feelings on the relationship with one of our oldest and best and most reliable allies. But the reality is that since the end of the Cold War, your interests have begun somewhat to diverge, and there's no doubt about it in the Middle East. Everybody with the French, the British, the Americans were real hot to intervene in Libya, and then we all walked away from the place, and it's gone to hell in a handbasket. So I guess that the President of the United States is miffed with Cameron, but I don't think you say those things to journalists and to say them especially about an ally like the Brits, but there's no question about it. When it comes to defense effort and all the rest of it, the two countries are moving gradually apart.
Well, I think that's a pretty mild rebuke, and I think the relationship between Cameron and Obama is very strong. On Libya, the British Parliament is investigating the British involvement in Libya because they were in the forefront of the effort to overturn that regime. And afterwards, the Brits were in charge of basically training the Libyan military, and then they abruptly pulled out. And so the Parliament is investigating how Libya became such a catastrophe, not only for the Libyan people, but for the British interests. I mean, after Gaddafi was ousted, David Cameron visited Libya twice, taking basically a victory lap. So I think what the president said, maybe he shouldn't have said it, but I think he spoke the truth that Mr. Cameron has gotten distracted. Among the distractions, though, is trying to keep the UK in the European Union, and the president really is behind him on that. So I don't think there's any big rifts here.
One of the principal tenets of the Obama doctrine, as articulated by President Obama to The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg.
Well, the most basic and obvious one is the, quote, don't do stupid expletive beginning with S and ending with T. But to avoid American entanglements abroad and to try and promote leadership by regional actors. I don't think it works out that way, and I think the Middle East is a testament to the failure of that viewpoint. But I think the president does have, I agree with Pat and Eleanor to some degree in a balanced sense, in that President Obama should not have said this to Jeffrey Goldberg. I think he regrets it. But he does have understandable and very legitimate points of grievance in terms of European allies saying one thing and doing another, not pulling their weight on defense. Britain is better than most, but still not good enough. Germany is the worst example. But also the degree to which they play games with the Russians on one side, allowing their finance in and then complaining that the US must do more. But specifically with Britain, I think a big point of contention below the surface is with China and the Asia Investment Bank, where the British government has become much more closely aligned with China than the Obama administration would want. On the British side, I think much more than annoyed about this, the real point of grievance was, and understandably on the British side, about the Falklands, where the administration through John Kerry had seemed to suggest that was open to negotiation. That caused a lot of consternation. I think this will be washed away, though.
Well, Libya is a special frustration for President Obama because elected to get us out of wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. This was a war he got us into with the best of intentions, trying to do something to save people from being massacred by Gaddafi. Gaddafi was overthrown, but the place turned into a mess, partly because of England not being there when we needed them. At the same time, the U.S. got tied up in Iraq and other Middle East problems. And it's been a real frustration for President Obama because his doctrine, such as it is to try to work more partnerships and not be aggressive with our unilateralism. And that's not going to work unless you can get countries like England, our best pal overseas.
Let me take your point there. You're right. I mean, we went in there for humanitarian reasons to stop Gaddafi from overrunning Benghazi and perpetrating a massacre. We should have held him up for 48 hours and then said, you're on your own. Right. We went in for humanitarian reasons, and we've left a humanitarian disaster for everybody in that place. I mean, Hillary Clinton is responsible, the Brits and the French are responsible, the president's responsible. I mean, if there is an archetype of what a disastrous intervention there is, that is it.
It was a NATO operation, and everybody took great pride in the fact that nobody died on the NATO side and that this was accomplished so well. And then they didn't keep at it the day after and the month after and the year after. And I think that was what was behind the president's remark in that interview.
And I do think here conservatives have to be careful about criticizing the president too strongly, because I guarantee you a lot of the people who are also very annoyed with the Europeans are the US military, because the Europeans claim a lot of the credit for doing these strikes, as they are in Iraq and Syria, but the people flying the intelligence missions, refueling, armaments, all of that intelligence and logistics backdrop is manifestly with the United States military. Absent that, it would fundamentally be incapable. They could not do it.
As somebody said, the Brits fired about 24 cruise missiles.
And they ran out.
Then they had to go back home and get some more.
And that's embarrassing. It's bad.
It's pathetic. It's pathetic.
But there are a lot of things in the intelligence world and special forces. The Union is very strong, and of course, the British have lost a lot of people in Afghanistan and Iraq. So
that's right.
The question: has President Obama transformed America's foreign policy for the better or for the worse, Pat Buchanan?
I think it's a combination. His reluctance to intervene is good, but Libya is a disaster. He shouldn't have put the red line down. And so I think overall, I don't give him high marks, but I do. His fundamental idea that we go in, we go together, and we get out and come home is right, but I think the application of it's been very poor.
He recognizes that America can't go it alone in all of these places, and the American people don't want to go it alone, and he has tried to engage the world. He has some notable successes. I would put the Iran nuclear deal and the opening of relations with Cuba on that list.
We will see. I just think American influence in the idea that the president seeks is best practiced by, you have to show consolidation at certain points that are very clear. And Syria will be a big stain on his presidency, 250,000 dead there.
I think he's added a very much needed element of caution to our overseas adventures, that we don't think we're going to go in and just solve other people's problems and install democracy overnight. We've learned those hard lessons. What to do instead now is a lot more complicated, and that's been a lot of big frustrations for him.
Threats from ISIS and Al-Qaeda have multiplied under Obama's watch. So our foreign policy is worse because of Obama's transformations. Relations with Russia and China are worse, and America is less trusted by its allies. What do you think of that?
Well, I don't think it's quite, the problem with ISIS came about because he underestimated their ability to grow as they have and their aggressiveness. So we learned those hard lessons. But he's turned the table on ISIS. They've lost ground more recently. They've become less organized. But it's still going to be a long, hard slug.
Well, what do we have a Defense Department for?
Well, we have a Defense Department in order to defend our interests, and that's the primary element of Obama's foreign policy.
Right, to make sure we don't get involved in another land war in the Middle East. That's
Article
why we have a
Section
Defense
2,
Department.
The President's the Commander-in-Chief.
Why don't they keep him informed?
They do.
Do you think they keep him
I
informed?
think the President is acting on his understanding of what American power can do, and American power military power is not going to solve what's happening in the Middle East.
Issue 2, lifeboat for Lula. Home to energetic soccer, the Amazon rainforest, the 2016 Olympic Games, and 200 million people, Brazil is a vibrant nation. And with an annual GDP of nearly $2.25 trillion, Brazil is increasingly wealthy. But led by President Dilma Rousseff, Brazil is in political crisis. That's because, already facing impeachment for possibly concealing government budget deficits, President Rousseff has now been implicated in Brazil's massive Petrobras corruption scandal. Fearing for their democracy, millions of Brazilians are taking to the streets to demand justice. And note this, another target of Petrobras corruption investigators, former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, has just joined Rousseff's cabinet. And while a judge has put a hold on his appointment, Lula's rationale seems obvious. Under Brazilian law, Lula's government office will shield him from easy prosecution. And because Lula is highly influential in Brazil's Congress, Rousseff hopes he will prevent her impeachment. Question, why did former President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva take a position in Rousseff's government? You don't want to try your hand at that, Eleanor?
Sure. Because under Brazilian law, a member of the cabinet can only be tried by the Supreme Court, and apparently that takes months and years. And so it would, in effect, put a cordon around him that he could not be prosecuted. But this is a huge betrayal of the people in Brazil, especially the poor people. I mean, they revere Lula. This is a huge blow, and the people in the streets tend to be not the poor, but the more well-off people who are angry about the collapse of the government. But it's the poor people who've been really betrayed here. And you've got Brazil going in, they've got the Olympics coming, they're battling the Zika virus. It's hard to see how this government performs. It's essentially paralyzed.
John, this is worse than Watergate. Far worse, and not only have the president of the country caught up in a couple of scandals, this is the great predecessor leader who had two terms, Lula, and he's been brought in basically to cover him. It's given him a measure of immunity from prosecution, and you got judges who are going after the government. I don't know how the government survives too much longer, and as Eleanor mentioned, you got this mosquito-borne disease down there that people read about all over the world, and you got the Olympics coming up this summer, I guess. And so I think Brazil's in very tough shape, and it wouldn't surprise me at all to see this government thrown out either legally or by the crowds in the streets.
And they've got a huge economic recession too, right. To add to the list of woes.
I think there are really three lessons here. First, it is the lesson of what happens when you have a socialist governance structure imbued with economics. It's ripe for corruption. And so I always think we should be careful when we have politicians talking about infrastructure spending without discretionary, without oversight. I think point two.
Unlike capitalists.
Never are corrupt at all.
Point two.
That's ridiculous.
Point two. Yeah, but government has some political insulation of itself. Point two. The problem you see in Brazil is that you have, as Anna said, some very poor people, and frankly, you have to give the Brazilian government credit. Bolsa Familia, I don't know the pronunciation, Bolsa the Family was a poverty program that actually has generated a lot of research and has had some very good effects. The final thing that I think is more positive is that with Brazil having this moment of crisis, with the judiciary finally standing up and providing scrutiny, it'll cause that beginning of real powerful institutions like the FBI that we have here, the uncorruptibles who will go after everyone, and in the longer term will address these issues. But it's going to be hard, and you also see similar things in South Africa with this political corruption. That is why you need a strong, independent judiciary, number one.
Well, those institutions are very important, and but this is fundamentally, too, a personal corruption that's going on here, where the present president was a protege of Lula, and so cronyism comes in on top of the corruption that's already involved in the initial scandal.
I just want to say that I think corruption is blind when it comes to ideology. You can find people across the ideological spectrum.
But it's easier to do in politics.
It's not exclusive to
Tom makes the
socialists.
point here when you mention South Africa. You take the famous BRICS, the emerging countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, all of them, and Turkey. Turkey has a horrendous problem with Erdogan is becoming an almost absolute dictator over there. Here's a country, John, 5 years ago, which was really on the, we have friends in every direction. Now it's got virtually enemies in almost every direction. It's involved in the battle in Syria. They got fighting against the Kurds. I mean, the world is in a very bad place.
How did we get from Brazil to
because
Turkey?
It's one of the BRICS. It's one of these emerging countries, great emerging powers.
I think one of the positives, I give him credit for it, President Obama. One of the few things I would give him credit for in foreign policy is the outreach to Africa in terms of rule of law that he's focused on. The President Obama is focused on rule of law in Africa as that develops, and China has the same kind of cronyism problems. I think this is a great example of why people should look to the United States for a rules-based international system.
What about the special interests and the control they have and the best Congress money can buy? I'm not going to put the U.S. naturally above every other country.
Well,
we have our problems too.
I will say, though, President Obama looks to Nelson Mandela as a model there in Africa, a lawyer also.
And they've betrayed his legacy.
And that's what's happened here.
Disaster with Zuma down there in South Africa right now.
Yeah.
South Africa's in a disaster with this Zuma character, and they got Malema and these people awaiting, or basically ethno-nationalists, very hardliners, are waiting for power.
But I think Lula is going to jail.
None of which is new in South Africa, but the one thing that has kept them at bay is strong institutions like the law.
They got rid of that Scorpion police unit.
Begs the question, is Lula Brazil's equivalent of Julian Assange? You remember Julian Assange?
Like
we can never forget Assange.
No, nothing like it, John.
No.
Nothing like
He's still
it.
sitting in there.
Meaning he's free only as long... Meaning he's free only as long as he stays beyond the reach of the law.
He's an historic figure. He's not some character that released some documents.
Yeah.
Right. And if you were putting money on whether he can dodge the bullet when it comes to legal prosecution, I'd put my money on Lula.
Yeah, Assange certainly was involved in something larger than just himself here, but and we are talking about sanctuary of sorts being offered by the law there in Brazil. But other than that, the similarities fade.
Yeah, well, Brazil is depending too much upon trade with China. Issue 3, hackers beware.
My budget includes more than $19 billion for cybersecurity, which is up by more than 1/3.
Hackers, whether stealing personal information such as credit card or social security numbers, or pilfering the innovative developments of U.S. companies, or copying U.S. government secrets, hackers are waging constant war with the United States. Some of these attackers work independently, some for criminal organizations, others for governments like those of China, Iran, and Russia. President Obama responded to criticism that his administration has done too little to counter hackers. So he has requested $19 billion to defend the U.S. government's information technology infrastructure. Funds, he says, are crucial for the nation's security. What's the most effective response to this kind of hacking? More security or more cyber deterrence? There you go, Clarence.
I'll take one of each, John. I think the fact is that chasing the hackers is especially complicated because they're always coming up with new techniques and new methods every day. So we need to be guarded in both ways, both preventing hackers from getting in and also being able to detect what they're doing and be able to use it to our advantage when we can, especially when we deal with overseas governments trying to hack into our systems.
Here's what I'm showing. Cybersecurity did not stop 22 million OPM files from being hacked by China. Cyber deterrence should be tried.
Yeah.
Is U.S. counter-hacking policy today analogous to counter-terrorist policy before 9/11, too reliant on law enforcement? Pat Buchanan.
No, I think that, look, if you're dealing with China, you're dealing with governmental hacking. You've got to have the ability to counterattack what they're doing. But given the proliferation of all these ITs and all the rest of this, and given the ability of these young kids and these people to break through it, I think this is an enormous problem ongoing. It's something in which I think the United States and Russia and these other countries, we're all going to have an interest in preventing and blocking and protecting what we've got going here in these countries, because the most advanced countries are the most vulnerable.
It's a new frontier for defense spending, actually.
That's right.
And I think the administration's response now is to sort of let folks who are doing it know that we know they're doing it, and you kind of send back little messages, but to avoid getting into a full cyber warfare.
But they're not reading those little messages. I think the problem here is that we have to take more of a stance in deterring these attacks, because the Chinese are playing us for a joke, and the president signs an agreement with him and then they go and break it.
Next question. Is President Obama's $19 billion cybersecurity budget request too little, too late, yes or no?
I think it's far more than it was, and I think it's accurate, but I do not know.
I think that he ought to be able to get it out of the Congress. If he can get anything out of the Congress, that should be it.
We need it, but we also need our senior people to stop using personal email.
It's kind of like Donald Trump's wall. Should it be 10 feet tall, 30 feet tall? The more we can do, but our spending shouldn't be wasteful. How about that for an answer?
I'll buy that.
Okay.
Issue 4, trade voters.
It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
I think, his business actually needs China. I don't know why he says something very mean.
In 2012, both presidential candidates, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, declared their fervent support for free trade. But this year, things are different.
Hey, hey, ho, ho, fast track has got to go.
After all, in 2016, Republican and Democratic Party frontrunners Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton opposed President Obama's free trade treaty, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. They say it will ship American jobs overseas and damage the U.S. domestic economy. And so, in the White House and on Capitol Hill, free trade proponents worry as the election gets closer, the TPP may become politically toxic. Why are voters turning against free trade? Pat Buchanan.
Because they've seen the consequences of 25 years of it, which have deindustrialized America, cost us tens of thousands of factories, millions of factory jobs, and it's created basically terrible economic conditions in the key states, John, of Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Illinois. And these are the states that could decide the presidential election. And Donald Trump is pointing to the trade deficits both parties have produced and the disasters in these parts of the country. And that's the issue, I think, that if Donald Trump could win the presidential election, that is the one he would win it on, and that is where he would win it.
Well, that would get him some of the, what we used to call Reagan Democrats, some of the blue-collar workers in these states. But in the recent round of primaries, Bernie Sanders won Michigan on the issue of trade against Hillary Clinton, but it didn't bring Ohio along for Bernie Sanders. There's a lot of hypocrisy on this issue. In 2008, Barack Obama said that he would renegotiate NAFTA when he got into the White House. Never went near it. And I think there's a lot of suspicion that Hillary Clinton, while she is opposed to the TPP for the moment, if she should become the president, she might evolve on that particular issue. I think trade is responsible for a lot of these losses, but there are so many other dynamics at work, and you cannot put up a wall around the United States. No. And negotiating rules that are beneficial to the U.S. and not to China are what the TPP is about.
I think one of the reasons there has been this populist uprising in support of Trump and support of Bernie is that for too long, conservatives such as myself who favor free trade haven't articulated the real specifics. And I think they're pretty obvious, I have to say, Pat, in terms of why free trade is beneficial. Number one, it manifestly has saved American families tens of billions of dollars in terms of reducing their consumer good prices. Number two, it has actually forced productivity increases and forced the United States to invest in economic sectors where we do very well. If you look at China, for example, what does China import from the United States? Integrated circuits, computers of high technology, aircraft, helicopters. And the question then becomes, as a country, what do we want the next generation to be building? Do we want to be making T-shirts to sell here? Or do we want to be making planes to sell at high prices abroad? As the global economy gets richer, the demand for those goods where we have a comparative advantage will increase.
Where do you think those Boeing planes get their wings made now?
But in Japan, we still export them.
You're talking
We're
about
at the export value.
All of your, even your high-tech things are coming in, taking those factories away, sending back parts. Look at your country, my friend.
But if you see TPP, one of the things there that is different, and I would agree with you, have a point here, is that the protection against patents, so that we have the ability to stop these countries, patents, to stop these countries.
Americanism, yes, indeed. But no, I agree with you about conservatives, and I would add that liberals, too, have not done a very good job of really explaining the benefits of trade, and also what have been the consequences of NAFTA and all. I beat you to it, Pat.
Can you get Hillary to explain the benefits of NAFTA in the fall to us? That would be most helpful.
Well, you know, the original question was why have Americans turned against free trade? I think actually Americans, I mean, I know coming originally an Ohio native and upper Midwest, workers have been complaining about our trade policy for years, but for the first time there is a leader, I got to say it, Donald Trump, who's become a spokesperson for this cause.
Yeah, but who exploits?
He himself takes advantage
exploits all of the loopholes that benefit visas, corporations. Right? So his argument is he knows how the system works, so he will change it? I don't think so.
False prediction. Hillary Clinton will secure the necessary delegates to lock up their party's nomination before Republican frontrunner Donald Trump, and Trump will lock up the nomination before the GOP convention. Pat?
Hillary Clinton is already there if she can defeat FBI Director Comey in the late primaries. But with regard to the Republicans, I do believe, despite what everyone says, that Trump will have enough delegates to go over the top before he arrives at Cleveland for an exciting convention.
Yes to Hillary and maybe for Trump.
Yes to Hillary. I don't think Trump will, but I do think, Pat is right on that FBI thing. John Schindler at The Observer, people should check out his writing.
I say yes on both. I think Trump's going to make it.
The answer is a double yes. Hillary secures delegates first, then Trump does it before GOP convention. Bye-bye.